Thanks everybody for coming. We've been talking about doing something like this for a while, and what I'm going to talk about specifically today is hopefully a setup for all the panelists to get drilled on later. But a lot of this is sort of how we've seen the world shape up at Sentry over the last decade, and sort of what's guided us on the direction we're going. And a lot of it is also going to be focused on what we see as still outstanding issues. So as I mentioned, I'm David Cramer. I'm the founder and CTO of Sentry. I started it a long time ago. These days I run R&D and technology. But I would say mostly I'm a very vocal, opinionated person. So you're going to hear some of those opinions today. So I think first and foremost, when we say software here, really what we're focused on is the front end. And this is kind of a tricky thing because if you've been doing this for a while, this word means different things to different people. And especially with the diversity of audience and even the panelists we have today, this is a very overloaded word. So often what folks think of as the front end is the browser, right? Like we think of Chrome or Firefox or Safari, and it's like, well, we have this JavaScript and that's our front end, or it's the UI of our website, right? Well, that's true. But it's actually changed quite a lot over the years. And while this term is not widely used, what we think of as the front end is any kind of sort of user experience that represents your business. And so at the very least, we can think about all these device-centric experiences where your code is often living on the user's device. And that's true with the browser today as well. And so even things like your TV or the PlayStation, those are just front ends for your product, right? And so that's really the setup for a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And that's the thematic overlay that we want to go into. And we think it's important because, the browser has changed a lot, but also the presence and the relevance of these other devices has become huge. We all know that mobile apps are super important, but you see all the IoT movement and all these devices in our homes as well that have screens and have applications on them. So it's really changed how we think about products. And I think one of the biggest things that kind of connects to this is how businesses and software has changed over the years. So if you look back, and I'm going to illustrate this with my version of how Microsoft might exist. So say you had Microsoft Office, and once upon a time, it was a big siloed team. They had different trades. They had the application developers, they had the platform developers, but they all sort of worked on Office, right? And it was contained, and you could kind of keep it in your head what it was. And then that's kind of evolved. And so these days, if you try to imagine what the Office team looks like, it's actually made up of dozens to hundreds of teams, right? Like even if you break it down to say Microsoft Excel, well, you've got Excel for Office 365 on the web. You've got Excel on your mobile phone. You've got Excel on Android and iOS, right? You've got it on Mac OS and Windows, and they're different applications. And those are often also different teams. And so we've sort of seen that shift, and that's kind of straightforward, right? We all recognize that it's more services, more products out there, and it's just more complexity, right? But the other really interesting, there's two other kind of core things we've seen at the same time. One, we all know that cloud providers are here. We all know that most of our infrastructure, the physical machines are outsourced to folks like Amazon and Google Cloud, right? That's kind of accepted. Like it's no longer well, maybe we'll use the cloud, maybe we won't, but that's the status quo. And now we sort of evolved that, and we think that next phase is going to be about that platform layer. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but basically sort of abstracting that platform layer in the same way we have the physical service. And you see that with common frameworks like Kubernetes, but you see it even more with things like Heroku and Vercel, where it pushes even farther on that boundary. And a lot of this is really centered around this concept that we need to move fast. And Facebook was famous for saying move fast and break things. Like nobody likes broken things. So I know they changed this. I don't remember what it is. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, like, we need to move fast. And that's one reason we have many of these teams. It's one reason we have this separation of concerns, right? And a lot of the changes we've seen over the years have been really to enable us to move faster. So if you think about going back to that Office paradigm, or even Windows, right? We all recognize Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows XP, those were all like multi-year release cycles. And they were multi-year release cycles because the ability to test was very complex. And most importantly, the ability to release was even worse. So you had to really have it stable, and you had to have QA really on the game to get a solid release out there, because you couldn't change it that easily, right? You're shipping disks, people are not downloading it from the internet. And a lot of that's changed. And that's why we see a lot of this adoption and this push for these sort of real-time front-end experiences where we can actually deliver an updated front-end, which is actually most of our product these days, almost instantaneously, right? It allows us to be very, very agile in the truest sense of the word. But it also has a lot of complexity behind it. If you think about, even the change in QA over the years. We've gone from huge, basically like only people-centric teams and some small pieces of the test infrastructure to big test infrastructures that are like bigger and more expensive than the people themselves these days. And that's important, but that's also how we think about a lot of what we're all enabling when we're building like B2B software for tech companies, especially Sentry, especially folks like Vercel. It's really this ability to be more agile. And so going even on that platform layer a little bit more, and I really want people to think about this. Like, we often talk about how things like Kubernetes have changed the platform, but they don't really change it for a lot of us. Kubernetes is just another way for that DevOps persona to manage servers, if we're honest with ourselves. And then you go to the other side and you look at platforms like Vercel or Heroku or the new DigitalOcean stuff, but platforms that really allow a developer, the application developer, which is basically the person building the business, the technology for the business. It allows those people, us, to actually ship our business, our product to the customer without worrying about the nuts and bolts. Like, I don't want to spend my time optimizing server configurations. I really just want to build the product that my customers are paying me for, right? And that, I think, is one of the most fundamental shifts it's still ongoing. And we don't know what that future looks like, but you can see a lot of really forward-thinking companies and people investing in these ideas. And you're going to hear about this later as well, especially on the web panel. We have Guillermo here. And so really think about how this is changing how we develop software, because this is fundamental and this is key to empowering everybody. The other sort of major trend we've seen is this rise of JavaScript. And I'm not talking about Node.js. I'm really talking about front-end browser JavaScript here, because this has become the biggest, most groundbreaking change in technology that I've seen in my entire history. And I've been doing this for about 20 years now. And what I think is really interesting is just the prevalence of JavaScript as a language across all platforms and the continued iteration on it. Now, it has some problems, and we'll talk about those. But what I found really compelling was, like, over the last 5 years, you've seen just developers completely shift into JavaScript. So this Stack Overflow, their 2019 survey, was around 70% of professional developers use JavaScript in their job. It doesn't mean they're also not using PHP or Java or Python or something else, but they are using JavaScript. And they're often using JavaScript for that front-end application. And what's really cool is it's no longer just animations. It's actually really rich experiences that are very fast to load, fast to interact with, and it's cross-platform. So we obviously have the browser, everybody's familiar with that, but we have things like React Native, which empower cross-platform native applications. We have things like Electron, same thing, but for the desktop. And it's becoming a really great component of sort of all modern applications. And the great thing about developers, it kind of translates. Like, if you can write JavaScript in the browser, you can kind of write it for React Native and Electron with a few changes, right? And that's a really important trend. Now, one of the challenges we see is there's a lot of this going on. So I'm just going to pick one of these, but years back, Airbnb was pretty famous for just saying React Native doesn't work. It's not a good solution anymore. Like, they had invested in it and they had dropped it and they had written about it, right? And even more recently, Shopify went entirely the other direction. They said, you know what, React Native is the absolute investment for us. Now, what's interesting is React Native has not changed that much in that time period. But what has changed is the tool chain around it. It's the ability to operate React Native apps, debug React Native apps, monitor React Native apps. And that's super important, because that's the same kind of tool chain that's changed around us. It's the things like Vercel enabling these deploys. It's the things like CI and CD existing everywhere to make it so we can write more automated tests versus waiting on humans to do things. And so I don't know that there is an answer yet to what the future holds. And that's going to be a thematic thing here. But we do know that there's a lot of learning we've done along the way, and we're going in the right direction. And so circling back a little bit, I want to refocus on that JavaScript lens, because that's going to be a thematic thing throughout the day. And if you've ever written JavaScript, you will certainly know it's far from perfect. Even if you just have dealt with it in the Internet Explorer days when nothing worked correctly, it was a different beast, but it's still similarly problematic these days. So I'm just going to illustrate a few problems that you're all probably familiar with. And my goal here is that you just nod along and you're like, yeah, this is a problem, and we should all fix it. And so I think the biggest challenge we often see, especially Sentry as a growing organization, is just the huge dependency graph. So this example is LeftPad, which I don't even remember what LeftPad does at this point, but it was a small library that was relied on by other libraries. And one day it just disappeared from the NPM package registry. And what that did is it basically took down the ability for many companies to deploy, because their NPM graph, their list of dependencies for the application, is hundreds to thousands to sometimes tens of thousands of packages long. And that is a really, really big issue, especially when those packages are just simplistic behavior that could be built into a language, right? And I think even bigger and more concerning from that is like the security vector and the maintainability that creates for us, right? Like there's a reason we like frameworks. We like them because they often come with, as Django used to describe it, or hopefully still does, batteries included, right? It comes with all these little utilities, these 5-line snippets of code. So we don't have to build them ourselves, but also so we don't have to install them from, a package manager because of these kinds of concerns. So I think this is something that's still fundamentally a challenge for the JavaScript space, even ignoring the tool chains around it. And there's been a lot of work there, but it is a big hairy mess, I would say. The second thing, and I think the thing that probably impacts us the most, is the sheer amount of sort of client-side JavaScript that we ship. If you think about, like, I have an iPhone, right? And I remember, it's gotten better over the years. I remember it used to be you had to connect to Wi-Fi to download half the apps because they were so big, right? And we have that same that same problem with the internet, with internet applications, right? Like if you are in a third world country or somewhere with poor internet, really running a lot of applications these days is not fun. They're very slow, they're very bloated. Sentry is certainly guilty of this. Now, we're fortunate that we're B2B and you're using it from a desktop computer and you're probably working in tech, so you have a fast internet connection that we can get away with it. But this is a real serious problem we have in the world. And if you look at this example, this is an illustration of our bundle. 44% of it is application code. So that means the other 55% is just third-party code. It's frameworks, it's utilities, it's libraries, it's shared code, right? And so there's got to be something better here. And I think we're going to hear a little bit about this today as well. But this is an area I see fundamentally changing. Like my belief is we have to go backwards to go forwards, in the sense of like we can't keep loading everything on the client. Either browsers have to start vendoring this, or we need to go back to rendering things on the server. We need to be more progressive loading. And I think that's actually the direction we're going to go. And I think on top of that, if you sort of look at that, in this case, this 25 megs of JavaScript, what we do in production is we ship it in this form that doesn't represent how we write the code, right? So this is minified code. This is Sentry's minified code. We write this in TypeScript, which then gets compiled. It probably skips all these steps, but if you take it in layman's term, it goes from TypeScript to modern JavaScript, which means JavaScript that is not implemented yet in the browser, to JavaScript, then to compressed JavaScript, right? And so it's very far removed from the actual original language that we wrote the code in. And what that means is we need better tools and capabilities to actually debug and understand those issues. Now, fortunately, JavaScript, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years ago, it's been a little while, they created something called source maps. You probably are familiar with them. But if you've ever tried to implement source maps, it's very, very tricky. And as an example, this was one of React Native's sore points for a number of years, is the way they built source maps and the way those worked for developers was really complex and hard to consume. And you'll find that's actually a common problem for a lot of these sort of framework and runtime developers still today. And so a lot of Sentry's investment was just, how do we use source maps and understand them so we can actually translate this into code that developers understand? And so that's just a few problems, but like if you think about it, there are a lot of these really big unsolved problems in the JavaScript community. And really what they cause to happen is we spend a lot of time developing things that our customers don't need or care about, if we're honest with ourselves. And, I think that kind of alludes to like the next thing I want to talk about, which is sort of performance. A little bit more of the same. Obviously, this is near and dear to Sentry, and I'm trying to not make this too much about Sentry, but this is sort of our take on performance, but it's also a framing of how we think about the world. So one thing we've recognized is that we can learn a lot from history, and the future very much looks like the present and the past. As an example, Sentry's core product, our error monitoring product, looks pretty identical to what it did 10 years ago, and it still solves the problems in fundamentally the same way. It's because software errors always look like software errors, and the concepts behind them don't change a lot. And I think that's important to recognize from a lot of what we've been doing, because, for example, Microsoft has something called Watson that I think it's like 2 or 3 decades old. It's just crash reporting. It's arguably no different than Sentry. It's been done before. It'll be done again in the future, right? And that same thing applies to basically everything we're doing. And so we've looked at that and we've said, well, how does that affect how we think about performance of our application in a broad way? And there's a lot to learn from not only those traditional softwares, but even the more modern, say, mobile frameworks and how that affects browser, right? And so the thing I will tell you that doesn't matter is metrics. And if you've ever been down this road where you try to diagnose problems from 100 graphs, you'll recognize the flaw in this. Like I have to correlate a ton of metrics to try to pretend I know what the problem is. And that is just me saying, well, based on my huge amount of knowledge, it's in my head, I can connect all these dots together and maybe I can identify the problem. That's bad for a lot of reasons, but the real reason a lot of this is bad is because these metrics no longer reflect what is core to our customers' experience. It used to be that you could just measure response time of your web server and that actually mattered, right? Now it's like your mobile app or your JavaScript front end, what's response time there? How much does that impact API response time? Well, it could be a lot, it could be a little. And so it's very disconnected now in what these metrics and these core metrics that we used to rely on actually mean. And so we've kind of moved that and we've said, let's forget about those ideas. Let's forget about those things that are often very valuable for monitoring servers and systems. And let's move more towards monitoring the software, the code itself. And we describe the code as the application. And we often say the application is roughly the front end, right? And that's where we connect all these dots. And that's important because it means the front end is your business, right? And that means the customers and the front end are tightly coupled, and it's the most important thing you can monitor, you can measure, and you can improve, as well as even improving your ability to iterate on it, right? And so that's been a big focus of Sentry, and it's why internally we always say, like, let's focus on the code. What can a product team change in the code, and how can that impact things? If I cause the system to run out of memory, I don't need a graph telling me that we're out of memory. What I need is something that says, hey, this change I made in the code caused us to run out of memory, and you're not getting any more memory because you don't control that device. You don't control that computer that the browser is running on. You don't control that mobile phone. So you have to work within the constraints you have. And that is super, super important about not only in the future, but the present, right? Like we all live with this now. And that's a different way to build software that a lot of us web developers are not used to because we never had to deal with those constraints when we were just building web servers, right? And I've got two examples of this I want to share. One is traces versus transactions. So if you haven't been hiding under a rock, you've heard about tracing a lot lately. It's not a new technology, but it's become mainstream because of how disconnected applications have become. And a trace basically says from the time your customer hits something all the way to the end, you can understand what happened. And that's helpful because it helps you diagnose the root cause, right? Like if the database is slow, way deep in this API request, we can say, well, the front end was slow because the API was slow because the database was slow. But if we're a front end developer, really what we care about is the front end slow and why is it slow? And most importantly, what is to blame for it being slow? I don't know how to optimize the database as a front end developer. If I'm like a mobile developer, I'm not running our database. So I don't need that information. And so as an example, Sentry's really focused on this concept of transactions, which is a request and response lifecycle. And we focused on it in a way that works with a trace, but in a way that what we think represents application developers. So on the mobile team, I really care about my view of the mobile app. Now I need to be able to diagnose when it's not my fault and it's another team or another service that we're using, but I really need to understand performance from a mobile lens, right? And so that's fundamental in how we think about tools and services that we're using and how we're building things. The second thing I want to talk about is going back to metrics. So I talked about how metrics are not that useful, but one of the reasons they're not useful is because of that relevance. So as an example, Web Vitals, which we're launching our first pass at today, is a useful metric. Now, is it the most useful? That's debatable because it's a little bit complex. But the important part of it is it reflects what a user experiences. It doesn't reflect what we as developers think might be important, which often is not important, right? It reflects how long did it take to render? How much time did the user spend waiting to be able to interact with your product, right? Those things we can all reason about and we can understand the importance. It does not reflect, is the load average on the server high? It really doesn't matter. Like if the load average is high and the application doesn't degrade, who cares? Like it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And most importantly, you may not even have a server and you may not be controlling any of those components. So that's kind of how we think about like some of the fundamental shifts that have to happen. So, today we've got a number of sessions that have people who are much more experts than I am in many of these things. And they're kind of all over the place, which I think is going to be exciting. And so we've got 3 sessions this morning. I'm hoping I have these in the right order, but one is about the web. It is fundamentally, you have to connect the browser to the web. So we have these front-end applications, but those are the new web applications, right? And how that's changing and what that's going to look like and maybe some of the pros and cons of that, like, because it's certainly not without its flaws, right? We've got a bunch of customers talking about sort of their pain. And again, think about front end because it's not just browser as well. It's also people who are shipping video games, the game clients. It's people who are shipping mobile apps. It's all over the place, but it's similar pain. And so there's a lot we can learn from those folks. And then we've got sort of a more centrist focus on like this cross-platform nature of what's changing and how it's changed. And I'm excited for this one because I think this is a very contentious one in what is good and what is bad about these cross-platform frameworks. This afternoon, there's a number of Sentry workshops. One is on our new performance monitoring components, which I think we're going to talk about web vitals and trends on there as well. Take a look at those if you're new to Sentry or if you just want to learn more about Sentry. But sort of the one thing I wanted to leave you with is I don't really have a prediction for the future other than it's going to keep changing. And people who are rightly naive are going to attempt to solve things in ways that seem crazy and scary. Like, think about serverless and cloud functions. They don't often make a lot of sense, but again, it enables developers to do stuff that was harder for some of those developers to do before. And so I think we're going to see more than that, but I think we're very early. I will say that I think we are sort of at this point where a maturity has come, just like with cloud providers, when it was like, well, are we still going to run data centers or move to Amazon? I think we're sort of at that stage where it's like, yes, we are going to build rich front-end experiences, but we have to solve for these problems. So the investment and the conviction is there by customers now, but we're still very early in the technology cycle of it. And that's all I have. Thanks everybody for attending. I believe I'm passing it back to Elaine now, and we'll sort of take it from there and move on to the next sessions. But thanks again.